these days we have to be really careful about the language we use. And that's particularly important if you've had a spiritual awakening or a shift of consciousness or whatever you want to call it. Oftentimes we go through an initial phase of wanting to proselytize because we want to tell everybody the good news. But it's not always well received. And today I'm going to be speaking to Dr. Sharon Letovsky about this very subject. How do you utilize language to make it accessible, especially in the workplace? So join us on Talking True, and thank you for being here. So, viewers love to hear stories, and I love to hear stories about how do you go from, especially in your case, how do you go from a mystical experience to the corporate world? Do you want to just detail what that looked like?
Ever since childhood, I always felt like I was on the wrong planet, as if as if I was looking at the world through strange eyes, wondering how did I get here, and what are the rules of the game, and how do these people behave, as if I was a visitor from. And it was weird. I mean, I didn't feel. I didn't have any memories of anything else. It was just I always felt different, and and I was always seeking. I was raised in a non-religious Jewish household that we weren't practicing regularly. The men in the family went to synagogue 3 times a year. It was more cultural than anything else. And I yearned for more. I mean, if the Jehovah's Witnesses knocked on the door, I would invite them in. I was always curious spiritually. It's like I knew there was more, but I didn't know what the more was, or whether it was other domains, or I'd even think that way. I just always felt off. As a matter of fact, later in life, I wrote poetry about that, about I always felt like I'm a spark of something bigger that's come and inhabited this place. And it's like, oh, really? Oh, it's like I'm visiting, a visitor. And then finally, when I was 29, I was married to a medical doctor. I'm born and raised in Montreal, by the way. And we were living in Toronto at the time, but had gone on a year sabbatical to San Francisco. And we were at a conference, a medical conference in Memphis, Tennessee. And three different people, doctors at that conference, during the course of one day, talked to me about Jesus Christ. Now, I'd never, as a Jew, you know that Jesus is somebody you don't believe in. I mean, it's the New Testament, and we don't believe that, but you don't know anything about what you're not believing. Just like you and I don't know a whole lot about Sikhism, we don't know. And so they told me, and I went, oh. I went to my hotel room afterwards, the end of the day, and I prayed. And I basically opened my heart, gave myself to Jesus. And I had this incredible mystical experience. It was a calling experience. It was if Uncle Sam wants you. Like I was pulled up by my sternum face to face. I can't say I saw anything. Well, you've heard this from experiencers before. There's no words. I didn't see no white cloud and beard, white beard. No, couldn't see or hear, and I didn't have any visions. I just had an experience of being pressed into service. And it's like Marilyn Ferguson said in her book, Aquarian Conspiracy, you go to the top of the mountain, you see, you come down, you see no more, but you have seen.
Yes.
And everything is different.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, what just happened? Like, oh, okay. So I said to God, okay, now what? And silence. Now what? Silence. Well, you called me, give me a job, give me a task. Nothing. And so I tried to tell my husband. He looked at me like I was nuts. Good thing he wasn't a psychiatrist, or he would have had me committed, that. And then I didn't know what to do with this. The next day, the conference finished, and we were heading back to our home in San Francisco. We're at the airport. We're running to check in to check in for the flight, and someone slaps a brochure in my hand. I go, you don't look at it. I threw it in my pocket instead of the garbage. Get on the plane. We're sitting down. I feel this bulk in my pocket. And I look, and it was a brochure. It was Jews for Jesus.
Oh, wow.
So when I got back to San Francisco, I contacted them, and they gave me a bit of, emotional support, but I was just still ditzy. And then we came back to Canada because the sabbatical was over a few months later, and I was essentially lost. So I just started reading the Bible and reading different things. I eventually connected with like-minded people in Toronto. And in time, within a year, I decided that I was always interested in personal and spiritual growth. So I went back to school. I had been a school teacher, so I had a teaching degree. I went back to school to get my master's and PhD in adult education, focusing on psychology, because I was just pulled to understand what was happening to me, what had happened. So I was pulled to read and to understand. Some people get pulled to meditate, and I did pray and meditate, but for me, it was more I wanted to understand. And I needed to pick a dissertation topic when I got to my PhD. And I had at this time started working with cancer patients, because what do you do when you've had an experience like that and you know there's more? And somehow being connected with the yoga community and other people, I got connected with this group at Princess Margaret Hospital in Toronto that did visualization and imagery with cancer patients to help whatever treatment they were getting work better. Because if people don't have a will to live, it's harder for their chemo to work.
Mm-hmm.
So I was involved, and I started having some private cancer patients of my own that I was doing counseling with, finding out what was going on in their life 6 to 18 months before they got sick. And it was always with the women it was all, and this was 12 years before Carolyn Mace came out with her book that came out in 94. This was in 1980, 1982, 83. The women, it was often trauma, big trauma or difficulty in relationships. With men, it was at work. With women, the cancer started here. With men, it started in the stomach. So when I had to do a dissertation topic, I ended up, so this is where the two paths came. Was I going to do my PhD on cancer patients and the effect that visualization and imagery can do on their healing? Well, if I wanted to get through my thesis in less than 10 years, I couldn't do a longitudinal study. Didn't have the time to do a control group and a experimental group and do the imagery with them and follow them and see who survived it. I wanted to get out of there. And then a thesis chairman said one of the best things to me, and I advise it to anybody doing studies, postgraduate studies. When you choose a thesis chairperson, it's going to be a marriage of a few years with that person. You better pick someone you really like or you really click with. And it was the best advice. And you got to pick a subject that you can stay wedded to, that you're really passionate about it. And I said, that's it. I got to do the mystical. I got to do mysticism. And so it was, my PhD was my own journey. Here I was, I'd had an experience that was outside of my background, and I didn't know what to do with it. And I was lost and I couldn't find support. So I interviewed 30 people who were like that and documented what their experience was like, how they changed, problems they encountered, how they solved their problems. That was one side. And then what do you do with that for a career? So I started working with people at the Cancer Institute, and I started taking private clients. And here's where the corporate stuff started. My last corporate client was my last patient was someone named David, 6 feet tall, skinny as a rail, stomach swollen with cancer. And he says to me, Doc, I want you to teach me to use my mind to heal my body. David was at the stage of life where he needed a priest, not a therapist. He was towards the end of his life. And I was working with people, although I did work with some people towards the end of their life, but I got them when the when the doctors couldn't help anymore, so we're gonna see what else we can do. In any case, I took down my shingle and I said, you know what? David was my last cancer patient. I'm tired of the funerals. I'm tired of meeting people when it's too late. I'm going to get a job inside organizations. Because I had a choice. I could be a couples counselor, or I could go into the corporate world and work with people and find out what is it. Because what I found for my patients is that the spirit dies before the body. Okay, they give up. With David, he had been dealing with such corporate stress that it literally twisted his guts. So my decision was, you know what? I'm going to get a job inside an organization. I'm going to go undercover and I'm really doing research. I'm going to find out people take a job, they want to make a difference, they're inspired, they have talents and skills. How long does that last and what kills it? And what can we do to prevent? So it was really cancer prevention that took me into the corporate world, but using the mind, visualization, meditation, okay? But you can't go into the corporate world and say, and at least you couldn't in 1988 when I joined the corporate world, and say meditation. This was woo-woo. I mean, this was really snake oil salesperson. So I had to talk about stress management. And it wasn't even common knowledge that stress and cancer were related. At this time, people were still saying that it's woo-woo. So I got a job with the Canadian Coast Guard as a counselor. So for those of you who know Star Trek, Deanna Troi, this way over here. Okay, I was Deanna Troi for the Coast Guard, and then 6 months later, I won the job. I was offered the position of my boss's job. So Deanna Troy's boss at headquarters. So they moved me to Ottawa, which was headquarters, and I became the head of counseling for all of Transport Canada, which included the Canadian Coast Guard, the federal airports, the airport firefighters, and we put in things like preventative stuff for post-trauma counseling, peer counseling programs, and I started to get away from what I went there for in the first place. And I gained weight and I started to get sick. And then someone came up to me and said, Sharon, you're a shadow of your former self.
Wow.
And I realized I was in danger of becoming one of my own patients. And that's when I remembered that when David died, I said, I'm going to get a job in an organization, find out what kills people, what destroys their spirit, and write a book about it. I forgot to say that part. So how I survived in the corporate world, and I tell this to those who are listening who may be struggling in the corporate world, remember why you're there and focus on that. Don't get distracted by the organizational insanity around you. Stay focused on what you're there for, because people get pulled off track and they get sucked into the politics or the behavior, whatever. And I wrote my book. I started interviewing people across the world, 50 interviews with people who started, and the book was called Surviving Organizational Insanity, Keeping Spirit Alive at Work. It was a bestseller, but it's out of print now, and I didn't want to rewrite it because listening to the stories again or rereading them is just too hard about what kills people's spirit. And it did well, and it reminded me, and that led me. I did end up having a health crisis. Thank God it wasn't life-threatening. I had surgery. I ended up taking a few years off, a sabbatical, back in San Francisco. And when I came back, after a few years as a book, I started helping people write their own books and publish them. This was just before Kindle. Now you can do that yourself on Kindle. And then I got searched. Someone contacted me and said, we need someone with your expertise to teach leadership courses for this training company. The training company is called Learning Tree. And I said, training courses. And so I reviewed the syllabus of the course and I looked at it and I said, hey, this is right up my alley. I could have written this. Turns out the author of the course, a fellow, um, same background as me, not cultural, but educational background, also very spiritual, has had mystical experience. He wrote what it really was is we were teaching awareness and consciousness under the guise of communication skills, leadership skills, assertiveness skills. But the activities that you were really doing were raising we're raising awareness and making people conscious. So I said, hey, wait a minute. If I do this, then I'm doing what I wanted to do with David. I'm teaching leadership. Because when I wrote my book, the main things that made people sick were uh, red tape, of course, vacillating vision of their leadership, and relationships. It's basically relationships. I've taught thousands of people in these seminars over the last 20 years, and I always do an activity that I ask them to think of two bosses they've had over the years. One they would follow to the ends of the earth, and another that they have no time for. And list me their qualities, and I do a brainstorming to fill the page. The entire page is filled with people skills. They had empathy. They got my back. They listened. They were understanding. They took care of their team. They blah, 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 blah. Maybe one person said knowledgeable. So, in teaching these seminars to leaders or managers or wannabe managers, what I was doing was going full circle, right? So, I'm teaching awareness, I'm teaching consciousness, I'm also preventing illness. When people used to ask me, what do you do for a living? I said, I teach world peace.
Yes. Wow. That's quite the story, and there's a lot to unpack there. And I love what you started with about the studies you did, and when you found out what the links were between cancer and unhappiness in the workplace or in relationships, because it's so true. But it's probably better now, but it was certainly overlooked in those days, as you said. So you were quite the pioneer, I would imagine.
We were. Those of us at the Princess Margaret Hospital, courses that were led by Dr. Alistair Cunningham, and I was privileged to be able to work with him in those courses and to help people. And it was at the forefront. As I said, 12 years before Carolyn Mace wrote that book on why people die, or why people, I forget the exact title. She had written other books. But we were right. Carl Simonton's work on the connection. It was about the connection between stress and illness, and people didn't believe it then.
No.
And it's refreshing now to see that. We talk about the language. You started that in your introduction. You were saying about the language in the workplace. Well, people are talking about mindfulness in the workplace now. That's a common word.
Yes.
Mindfulness. People would have, expected you to walk in a monk's robe if you were talking about mindfulness 20 years ago. But it's much more. People have yoga classes at noon in the workplace. So I say to anybody, don't expect your friends to be spiritual the way you are. If you limit yourself to your only friends are spiritual friends just like you, clones of you, not going to have many friends. There's or spouses. That's
Mm-hmm.
something else that I found in my study. Most of the women were single or divorced. If you're married or living with someone who's spiritual, have patience with them. Or if you're spiritual and the person you're married to or your good friends aren't, talk about other things. As you've heard me say in the past, Julie, people are diamonds. They have many, many facets. You're not going to match all the facets on someone else's diamond all the time. So in
No.
the corporate world, for example, my thesis, I interviewed people who were evangelistic Christians, born again Christians, extreme right. I didn't use the word mystical experience. I called it your conversion experience because that was a language that they understood. I called it the baptism of the Holy Spirit because that's a mystical experience in their world. Right. If
Yeah.
you're in the corporate world and you want to talk about, um, I tell people, I'm going to give you some peek into the psychologist's toolkit. I'm going to teach you some people skills. Um, I'm going to teach, and so it's it's not weird if I called it meditation or if I so it's very important to match your language to the language your people are dealing with because many people are on the same quest. They may not be God people, but they may be on the same journey, just using different language. And it's not a sin to change your language.
Right. Right. Because, unless you know how to utilize language in a way that's accessible, it's going to be divisive. And that's the last thing you want. And it's really easy, which is where I started with the whole sort of proselytizing thing. When you have some kind of conversion or mystical experience, you want to tell everybody the good news.
It's like you just invented ice cream and it's so good, you can't not tell them.
Exactly.
But they don't want to, but it's, you have to people have to realize, maybe don't have to, but it's good to realize that you will go through a process in your mystic, the first time you have experience, it'll rock your world and it's a private world. So it's probably best to keep it to yourself and allow it to work through you and read and develop yourself. And over time, you will slowly begin to, it's not as if if this is your friendship paradigm, like your mental paradigm has expanded. Well, you don't have to cross out that paradigm. You could just expand your friendship circle to include people who are in this paradigm. None of my closest, no, I'm part of a gang of a half a dozen women friends my age. I'm the only one who's spiritual. And they're all dear to my heart. They're all very dear to my heart. And that's okay.
Yes.
We run into a problem, and never mind, that's why I say world peace. We run into a problem when we want the other guy or gal to think or believe what we think or believe. And we think that I'm right, you're wrong. And the minute we go there, we have problems.
Yes. Yes. So can we come back to some of the trainings you did in the workplace?
Sure.
What was some of the language that you utilized to help people sort of come together? Because I'm imagining that they would be all from diverse backgrounds and belief
Yeah, well,
systems.
I never used religion. I never used the words religion, but it was funny because religious people in the class would send me private texts like they got it. Okay, but I didn't teach, um, for example, um, emotional intelligence. If you're teaching emotional intelligence basically has four parts. It's like a quadrant. It's about self and others. So noticing your own emotions and managing them, noticing the emotions of others and relating to them. Okay? You can't do box 2, 3, and 4 if you don't do box 1. Box 1 is noticing your emotions and then stopping, taking some deep breaths. I say stop, look, and listen. I say mind the gap the way they do in the British tube. Mind the gap. You have an emotion, you feel angry, don't jump. Stop, take a deep breath, mind the gap, take a few breaths, think about, okay, how old do I feel right now? Oh, I feel like a 5-year-old. And Okay, take a deep breath and then make a conscious choice about what am I going to show? Like, you can't tear their head off, you can't shoot them. So notice your emotions, and then before you respond, choose your response. And only after you've done that are you calm enough to notice what's going on for them. But if you don't calm down, how can you notice what's going on for them? Because you're too busy in your own craziness. Then you notice what's going on for them. And then the fourth box is connecting. So, how is that not spiritual? It's mindfulness. It's awareness. It's becoming conscious. I told them the purpose of this class is I'm going to make your unconscious behaviors conscious. We tell them we all run on autopilot, and nobody teaches us people skills. You're just supposed to learn them from your family or automatically. And people think, well, if you're a person who's quick to anger, or if you're a person who's a big introvert or a big extrovert, well, that's the way I am, tough, too bad,
Yeah.
so sad, that's me, too bad. I said, yeah. I said, I'm not going to change your personality. I'm not going to make you somebody different, but I'm going to teach you some skills. All right. You weren't born a carpenter, but maybe you learned some carpentry skills.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you weren't born speaking French, but maybe you learned French. So why can't you learn? Just because you're quick to anger doesn't mean, and they teach the same thing in anger management classes. If people who have abuse problems are forced to take it, they're taught the same thing. And how is that not awareness and becoming conscious? How is that not being in the moment? And I didn't write emotional intelligence. That's not my book. So the psychology books are full of spiritual stuff. If you're a spiritual person, you'll recognize it. You'll say, oh, that's awareness. That's
Yeah.
consciousness. I'm making them conscious. I'm bringing them. How to diffuse an argument with a spouse or with a colleague is be in the moment, not in You're mad at them because of what they did last Tuesday or what you're afraid they're going to do next year. Well, how is that not spiritual? Being in the moment, being here now, and not dragging in the past. Have I answered your question?
Yes, yes, yes. I love that. And also, it's such an easy strategy when anger does come up to say, "How old am I now?" To look at that because,
How old do I feel right now?
yeah,
Yeah.
yes, because
And
that usually links to trauma or some learned behavior or something that happened in the past, right? I would say.
and the second question, how old do I feel right now? So I feel 5. So be 5 for about 30 seconds in your head, and then say, well, how would an adult respond? Right? And but again, it's awareness, it's mindfulness, that gap in between, that's spiritual practice. And those of us who do spiritual practice call it consciousness, we call it mindfulness, we call it being awake, being aware. I wanted to wake up the workplace, but if people are anti-spiritual or not interested in things spiritual, they'll never learn consciousness and awareness because it's not taught in the school system. So how am I going to, so my reach, I decided I don't want to, believe me, after I had my mystical experience, I wanted to go into the ministry. I just couldn't decide which religion to
Yes,
choose.
yeah.
They're all so wonderful. So, but then I decided I wanted to be bigger than that. I want to reach I don't want to preach to the choir. I want to, and it was amazing because most of Learning Tree, that company, most of their client base is IT people, technologists. To them, psychology is like, it's not even a science, right?
Yeah.
It's not even a legitimate science because it's not based on what you can touch, taste, smell, feel, or see, the 5 senses. It's not it's not uh, uh, come on, anyway, the name escapes me. Research that's
Uh,
that you can touch with your senses or the extensions of your senses. If it's based on personal report, your research, it doesn't count to them. So I would have to say it in a way that they would listen, that they not would listen, that they could hear it and that it looked useful for them. Because I told them I want, after every quarter of the day, like at break or noon, whatever, or every chapter of the seminar, because the seminars lasted anywhere from 2 to 4 days, I would say, what's one takeaway from the whole morning? I don't expect you to memorize the chapter. What's one way in which you're different from the people who didn't take this class? Just one thing. Okay.
Yes.
And so if they come out with 2 or 3 takeaways from the whole 3 days that have a ripple effect on your whole life, how valuable is that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complete game changer. And the other thing is, especially in the workplace, if you have people that are really turned off spirituality because of religiosity, they've had a experience at church or whatever, and they
Yeah.
really turn against it, you're not going to get anywhere if you use language that has that kind of spiritual flavor.
And not only that, it's really against the law. I mean, or I don't know about, it depends on what state or province or country. You and I are in 2 different countries. There is legislation in some states, religion is good, in some states it isn't. And you've got to be sensitive because our workplaces are very multicultural now. So, but I'll, as I said, I'll get a private text from a Muslim or a Jew or a Christian in the class or a Buddhist. I know where you're going with, like, it, it's, you want to, in the corporate world, you've got to be inclusive. And the way to be inclusive is to talk about the human condition and people and peace and communication skills and keep God out of it. You talk about, I'm connected to something, not even connected to something bigger than yourself, because again, that assumes a mystical experience. And what's really important is that they're not wrong. It's not our job, mind you, for those listening who may be very religious of a certain faith that is called to convert others. I'm not telling you you shouldn't. You got to do what's right for you. My experience was in the organization I worked for and the country I am. You cannot proselytize in the workplace. You can't. It's not considered. It's not. You can be chastised for that. So I think it's, it's funny. I have to quote a study. There was a study in Harvard Business Review. I think it was by Paul Dark or something like that, begins POL, and they were quoting the results of this study on motivation in the workplace. And it was a summary of this research that had been done that researched 23,000 people over 9,000 organizations around the world. And they asked them, what motivates you in the workplace? And they kind of expected the results would be, higher pay, more responsibility, more authority. You know what it was? It was respect. Respect. Respect what? So I would say to mine, I would tell my people, quote this study, the classes. I would say, respect what? What do you respect? And I say that to all the viewers as well. That what people want from you is respect. And maybe people may say they want acknowledgement, but that's part of respect. So respecting what? Their background, their culture, their work experience, their perspectives, their values, their beliefs, their whatever. You don't have to agree with someone. Unless, of course, their values are murder and deadly stuff or dangerous stuff. You can say, well, I'm not there and I wish you well and bye. But so, but respecting, and respect is included in acknowledgement, so that's what this is. If you want to teach spirituality in the workplace, you got to speak in a language that people can hear. I'm going to do no good if I go into an American workplace and speak French. They're not going to understand me. It's the same thing. I would compare people skills to learning a language or learning a sport, or it's just more tools in your. I often got, I'm learning this course. Why should I do it? They're the one who's got the problem. Why should I be the one to be? They're not doing any work. I'm doing all the work. I say, well, yeah, but if the way you respond stops an argument, who benefits? And if you took a course in carpentry, but they didn't, and the door fell off the hinges at home, would you not fix it just because they didn't have a course in carpentry? I shouldn't have to do the chores just because I took a course. Like, it's
Yeah.
like you're smarter. You have the advantage. If you took this course and you know these skills and you've got a toolkit that includes some psychology skills, you've got an advantage over them.
Yes. So on that note, Sharon, are there any sort of tips, tricks, or strategies that you could share with viewers about how to deal in the workplace with, let's say, a boss that is insensitive or disrespectful or whatever, or because it's not, we all say, oh well, you should look for another job, or but it's not so easy, right? Oftentimes you have to dig deep, stay where you are, work through whatever before you can another opportunity comes up. But
it took a while for me. I was told before I moved to Toronto that this man I was going to work for was a bully, but I thought, oh, I can deal with that. Ha, silly me. And it took me a couple of years to figure out what to do. And because most of the people who complained, as I said, about unhappiness in the workplace had to do with their relationship with their boss. So if you're in that, people find themselves in that position, you're very, very um, in good company. Of course, if the boss is, I was going to say, if they're abusive, they're physically abusive, of course, you have to report that right away. But people can sometimes be emotional. My boss was emotionally abusive without realizing he thought he was being funny. So I made the mistake of threatening a harassment complaint. And boy, when you do that, so I would say don't go there first, folks, because it gets their back up. They get terrified because under the bully is a terrified child. And the bully is a scream. It's a defense mechanism. I'm going to get them before they get me. Underneath it was a terror. So in retrospect, I look back and I say, that's your last resort. So here's a general rule for you. When you don't know what to do in a relationship, shut up and listen. And what that means is that we come into a relationship with our agenda and they've got their agenda. And it's like railroad tracks, parallel lines. We talk about what we want, they talk about we want, and ne'er the twain shall meet. So if you have a boss like this, one of you's got to stop. The smart one, good negotiators. I taught this in negotiation skills courses. Listen first. So shut up. And just how I solved my bully boss problem. I knew he came to work early in the morning, half an hour early. And I had 3 kids, and I was divorced. I had a single parent, 3 kids, 2 of them were teenagers. The last thing I wanted to do was come to work half an hour early in the morning. I made it my business to get to work early in the morning before, just when he was there, just the 2 of us. And I would knock on the door, go in his office, sit on his couch and say, hey, Jean, what's new? And then shut the heck up. And after a couple of days of doing that, he started telling me his troubles, how he was miserable in his job and how he was he was being forced to make changes in the organization that he didn't want to make. And so I don't need to tell you my Jean story, how that ended up. I ended up getting him, he retired 3 days later. That's not your people's story, your listener's story. The story is, if you really listen to someone you're disagreeing with, or someone who's being abusive, what you're listening for. People love you when you listen. Listen like it's the most interesting story you've ever heard in your life, without going, yeah, but, waiting for them to take a breath so you can jump in with your story. Then you're back to the parallel lines. Listen with compassion. Even if you disagree, respect. They have a right. If you want respect, show they have a right to their opinion, even if it's a nasty opinion. Just listen. And you're doing two things while you're listening. The first thing you're doing is you're showing caring and concern. You just, really? Oh, isn't that interesting? Don't commit yourself, don't agree, don't disagree. Listen. But you're also looking for a hook. You're looking for something they say that you can agree with, or something they say that shows you what's important to them. Do you know what was my big problem with Jean? You know what was the source of the big problem with Jean? I'm a visionary. He's a numbers guy. When I was proposing these critical incident stress management programs, those are to prevent post-trauma down the road. You do that right after. Or peer counseling for air traffic controllers. I was talking about how it would increase the well-being of the workplace, and how people would stay longer in their jobs, and they would, or they wouldn't become alcoholics, and everybody would be kumbaya, He wasn't interested in kumbaya. Show me the numbers.
Yes.
How much is this going to cost me? Is my boss going to like this? Can it be within my budget? Will it? And for me, numbers, I can do numbers. I can do them very well, but they hurt. But it hurts,
Yeah.
And it hit me like a bolt out of the blue. The reason he was giving me a hard time was because I wasn't giving him what he needed. He was rejecting all my proposals because I wasn't covering the bases. I had to give him what he needed in order to be able to say yes. But I was so busy trying to sell my side that I wasn't listening for his. I don't know that I would have valued it if I'd heard it, because I'm older and wiser now. Even if you're not a numbers person and the other person is only a numbers person, respect them. So you're looking for, what do they value? What's important to them? And they may be asking you for more detail than you're comfortable with, because they're a detail person. I'm not a detailed enough. I got my 2IC, my second person. Hey, Sandra, get me the numbers on this. Added a section on numbers, and poof, poof, we started getting approved. But I wouldn't have got there if I didn't shut up long enough and respect him enough, even though I didn't like him and I didn't like his management style, enough to be able to figure out, I'm not calling him a dog, but if the dog barks, if you have a dog and it's not barking because it feels like singing a song. It's barking because it needs something to go out, food, the letter carrier went by, whatever. When the need passes, the dog calms down.
Mm-hmm.
Difficult people in the workplace have an unmet need. You want to work with them, find their unmet need and meet it to the best of your ability, or get somebody else to meet it. And surprisingly, the dog will probably, some people are just born miserable and they're going to die miserable. Jean retired and died 2 years later. He was born miserable and he died miserable, but he stopped being miserable with me.
Yes, which is key, right? Because you can, the workplace can be really horrible if you have somebody that you can't communicate with, and you don't feel valued, and all that, all of those things.
That's another thing. People want to be valued and appreciated in the workplace. That's part of respect. But people live in their own little bubble. They're so worried about being valued and appreciated themselves. They're not thinking about you.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to ask ourselves, and I say to people in the workplace, you're getting sucked in to wanting people to behave differently, wanting the organization to be different. Remember, what are you there for? What, and I ask this question, for you to put your head on the pillow at night and say, that was a good day, what has to have been in your day? And it can't be something that depends on somebody else. It can be, oh, my boss showed me appreciation. Well, you can't control your boss. You're not your boss's parent. You're not their parent. You're not responsible for their behavior. You can't change their behavior. Okay. The only way to change their behavior is to alter how you are with them, change their personality. What needs to be in your day that's within your control for you to say that was a good day? And I ask this to my classes, and they'll say things like, I solved the problem. I made somebody smile. I fill in the blank.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I solved a technical issue. I got everything done on my to-do list, or I got my most important things done on my to-do list in the moment without worrying about fixing everybody else around us. And difficult people figure out what's going on with them, that what's their unmet need. I mean, there was someone in the workplace who was miserable to everybody. He was a peer. He could throw a monkey wrench into every meeting. And one day I happened to be in line with this person, uh, getting coffee before work in the morning, and he was complaining. Not only that, he didn't bathe often enough either. So it was kind of that added to the problem. And he was talking about a meeting he'd been at till after midnight the night before. He's president of this volunteer sports organization. I'm going, who is this guy? And what did you do with the grouch? And I realized there was more to this guy than I knew. Tell me, what do you do at the organization? What's your job? So he took me to his cubicle. They had moved him to a cubicle in the back of nowhere. And he showed me all these manuals of his, and I realized he was very knowledgeable. And I started using him as an advisor in my programs. Because everybody had shut him down. You know, he had been sidelined for promotion years ago. He was only a couple of years away from retirement, and he had a chip on his shoulder bigger than his head. And but not with me. Now, I'm not great. I'm no better than anybody else. I'm just saying that nobody had been shown him, he hadn't experienced being respected in a very long time. And it turned him into a really nasty person. So,
That's heartbreaking.
yeah.
But it,
But,
yeah, but it's common, right? That's what happens when people feel overlooked. They don't feel like they've got any input. Nobody listens to, all of those stories.
and it may feel that way, but it may not actually be what's
Actually, that
in
way.
their mind. Remember, if it happens to us, we mustn't grasp it.
Hmm.
Like I had an experience the other night where I sent something and someone got offended. And I said, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it that way. And she said, well, it sure sounded that way. I said, well, it wasn't what I intended. I'm really sorry. And but I kept replaying that over and over in my head the next day. How could she take it that way? How could she possibly have misinterpreted what I said? I thought I was being humble, and and then I said, wait a minute. That happened once. It lasted 5 seconds. I've continued it for 3 days, for a day. Who's hurting whom? I'm hurting myself. Wait a minute, stop. You don't know what she's thinking.
Hmm.
Maybe she heard you and it's gone. So we have to watch as the Buddhists say, how we create our own suffering. Everybody suffers, but when we most of our suffering, not all, people get sick and people die, there's real suffering. But a lot of our suffering is caused by our own mental ruminations and clinging to things. I ask people in my seminars, how many of you are still angry at someone for something that happened a long time ago? And every hand in the room goes up. Well, they hurt you back then. Who's hurting you today?
Yes. Isn't that the truth?
How is that not mindfulness? I mean, that's mindfulness. That's Buddhist teachings. But we can teach that in a class as part of people's skills. Just don't call it Buddhism.
Yeah. Yes, and again, it's all about the language, right? It's all about language and being aware of what's accessible to people, and just making it easy.
Yeah.
Well, Sharon, I can't excuse me, I can't believe how fast the time's gone, but we've kind of coming to the end of this episode. But I would love you if you have anything else you want to share, if with the viewers, that would be really great before we close off.
Well, thank you for listening. I think I'm used to running a lot of seminars, so I'm used to talking on camera. I'm afraid I didn't give you, so I hope I gave people lots of grist for the mill. And I wasn't bragging that I talk on camera. I was saying I hope I gave you a chance to get a word in edgewise.
No, it's really lovely actually to hear you speak from your direct experience. It's really great because these are really tangible. They're really, big problems for most people. How do you, okay, you've had a spiritual awakening. How do you then kind of, I don't want to say cope, but how do you flourish and grow in a work environment, especially if it's really challenging? And how do you find the language? So it's been very helpful.
Especially when we feel like we're from another planet, back to the beginning, we feel like we're the only one. And that's okay. Remember, they're doing a spiritual journey too. They just may be calling it something else. We're not as alone as we think we are.
Exactly.
We think we're alone just because we don't speak the same language, but we're not as alone as we think we are.
Yeah. And because again, I think that's a common feeling. I really felt strange, alienated, like I didn't quite fit in. I felt that from when I was very, very young. And I think that's I'd say the hallmark of somebody who has a sort of mystical orientation, i.e. wants to discover the deeper truths of life. And then you get older and you realize, wait a minute, this isn't so unique. A lot of people feel the same way.
Yeah, or go at it differently. Like I had a good friend who was very into, Buddhist reading and spirituality, but I mean, he was an atheist. I mean, he doesn't like the concept God because he'd been turned off by his Catholic upbringing that he did not resonate with any longer, and he threw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yes.
But it didn't stop being spiritual. He just didn't call himself religious.
Yes.
So just know you're not as alone as you think you are. I'm telling people there are communities out there. Just I just found where you and I just found each other on a community that popped up out of nowhere on YouTube the other day. I mean,
yes,
like
yes,
popped up out of nowhere.
Exactly. Somehow consciousness, universal consciousness knows when to present things in front of us when we're seeking, even if we don't necessarily know we're seeking. Somehow these signs, messages, and whatever always pop up.
One of the hardest things I found is that when people in my study had religious experiences, if it happened within a context that they were already a part of. Like if they were already at a yoga retreat and they had an experience at the yoga retreat, or they were in a church and they had a religious experience, then you have a context that makes it easier. But when it comes at you out of the blue, it's harder. And I
Yes.
would say use the internet, use YouTube, use Google, there are all sorts of communities that you can connect with on YouTube of people who've had that experience. So you don't need to flounder alone. And
Yes, because finding community really helps.
it's the biggest thing is finding community and because people want to stay on the path and they feel alone. Find community and don't be afraid to change communities a bit until you don't be afraid to taste a few of the chocolates in the box before you decide on which is your favorite flavor, you know.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. So, Sharon, on that note, thank you so, so much. This has been really great. And I'm sure viewers will get a lot of value from what you've shared today. I'd love to have you come back and join me again on Talking True, because I'd love to dip into other themes with you. It'd be great.
Absolutely.
So let's,
Anytime. And I look forward to seeing you in other venue, other venues. Yes. Thanks for
okay,
having me. It's been
you're
great.
so welcome. Thank you.
Okay.
And thank you, everybody, for joining us on Talking True today. As always, please let other people know if you find this content has value for you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, you know what to do. So that's bye from us for now. Take it easy, be well, and see you again soon. Bye.